going on, YouTube world? Welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Dusty, and as always, this is the Shred Academy. Today, we're gonna be discussing something you guys have been asking for, so here I am doing it. We're gonna be talking about hip jumps. Approach, execution, landing, the whole thing. It's honestly a lot like a whip without actually having to turn back. So without talking anymore, let's get going down to that hip. Okay, everybody, here we are at our first two hips. Right in front of me here, we have our first hip. And it goes from maybe on the skinniest side, maybe 3 feet, and it widens up to probably about 7 or 8 feet. You could even go out here and you might even get to like 9 feet. The lip of the hip comes up, and then it's a hip to the right, landing down there. Now, we also have a lip set back a little farther, and we'll get to that next. Before we get started on approach, form, and landing, let's talk about which direction is going to be easiest for you to learn the hip on. It's basically whichever direction you feel most comfortable carving, that's the direction of hip you should learn on. That doesn't mean that if you don't have that direction of hip available that you can't learn. It's just going to be a little more difficult because you're going to have to force yourself to be good at carving in the other direction. Now that we've talked about which direction is going to be easiest for you to learn the hip, let's talk about speed. Now, if we just equate this to a tabletop, if you are looking to do a 5-foot hip and you can clear a 5-foot tabletop, you're going to want to approach the hip with the same speed as you do the tabletop. So find a tabletop that you're comfortable with, measure the distance, feel the speed, and that's the speed you're going to take to the same size hip. I just wanted to talk a little more about the size of hips so you can understand how to equate it to your tabletop that you're comfortable on. So in the inside, you're always going to find the shortest distance of a hip. So if you're just a beginner jumper but you want to learn hips, find a hip that has a short distance inside, count out your comfortable distance of your tabletop, and that's going to give you where you should take off. And then it gives you also a bigger range of error because your landing fans out. So you can kind of almost jump more straight rather than if you take off on the outside, you definitely have to carve inside, and it's going to be a longer distance to travel. So a hip will give you multiple distances of tabletop for different skill levels. So now that we've got this dialed, let's move on to approach because they kind of work hand in hand. Now that we've talked about your speed and you know where you're going to take off of the hip to equate it to your most comfortable tabletop distance, let's talk about your approach. Now, in a hip, you are going to have to almost transfer direction in the air, and we're going to do that by carving off the lip. The drasticness of the carve is going to affect how sideways you get in the air. For a beginner, if we're going to take off maybe, say here, because we want to do a 4-foot hip, we want to start somewhat to the outside so our carve is nice and mellow off the lip. But we don't want to start too far out that as we carve off the lip, we're going to end out somewhere out here. So moral of the story, if you're a beginner, make sure you're not carving too hard off the lip and you're starting more to the outside so your carve can be really mellow and you're honestly almost straightening up and squaring up to the landing off the top of the lip. Now, if you're getting pretty good at hips and you want to start getting a little more sideways, start inside, do an outside carve, and then carve inside. and you'll get sideways off the hip a lot more. It'll be a little more steezy, but as well, it's a little more difficult. So if you're a beginner, make sure you're starting outside and just getting that nice mellow carve off the lip, and don't start to drastically increase your arc until you're getting more comfortable. Hey guys, quick side note. We are going to use the slightly larger lip that I showed you earlier to do our form breakdown, because with a slightly bigger lip, it's kind of easier to see the motions because they're a little bit more spread out. But the motions are exactly the same for a smaller lip. Things just happen a little quicker. Okay, now that we've talked about speed and approach, we can talk about form. And our approach is also going to dictate some of our form. And like I said, starting outside is going to make our carve a lot easier. Now, as I approach this, I'm in my relaxed attack position. I'm not squatted down into my bike. Now, at this distance, I'm about maybe 5 feet away from the edge of the lip, and I'm actually going to start my carve here. Now you'll notice I start my carve and my body weight preload at the same time, and I'm not forcing my body weight down into the bike, I'm just setting it into the bottom bracket. Now as I carve off the lip, notice I'm starting to dip my shoulders and I'm rotating them to essentially square up to the landing. Now at the same time, I'm also going to start to rotate my hips around to square up to the landing as well. Now as I approach again, my body weight dips, and this, right as my front tire leaves, is where I'm going to start my explosion. So let's go on over to another view, and I will come into the screen eventually. There I am, relaxed, body weight preload, accepting the direction change, starting. I'll come into the screen here, eventually, nice and relaxed. Now as I start my body weight preload, I'll start that carve. My shoulders start to dip, rotate, as well as my hips, accepting the direction change at the same time, making sure that I'm making sure that my chest is not going to be pointed downward, that I'm accepting this direction change. Now as I reach the top of the lip, this is where I'm going to start my explosion. My body weight becomes a counterweight for this front wheel to keep going up, and I keep this shoulder dipped as well as my hips rotated. Now as I make it halfway through, this is when I'm gonna basically finish the explosion and pull my hips up and forward over the top tube using my arms and my legs. Now you can start to turn your wheel a little bit as you're gonna whip or something, because it's essentially a lot like that, but you're not having to turn back straight down the landing. You can essentially use this whip technique to help you change direction in the air. Now as I travel across, okay, notice my wheel turning a little bit. Now as you make it halfway across, this is where you're going to want to make sure your shoulders are squaring up to the landing if you've kind of over rotated a bit, as well as your hips. And then I'm rolling the bike forward and pointing that front wheel down so we can talk about the landing next. As requested, we're going to dissect a little bit of POV footage of this. So here I am approaching. Notice that I am on an outside path here. As I approach, you can almost see I start my carve there. I'm starting to dip my shoulders. Now, this is a great view. Notice how the view of the camera is starting to go up. That's because that's where my chest is pointed, because that's where I'm more or less headed to. Now as we roll through this, I start my explosion. Notice right there, you're going to lose the handlebars. That's because I'm really actually going to try to more carve hard and whip. Okay, you'll notice right here, boom, kind of whipping that bike hard. Okay, and I've made my direction change in the air here. So let's go back, we'll go forward. Notice the direction change there, okay? My shoulders have rotated to accept the direction change, as well as my hips. Now it's important, once we're sideways, right? We're sideways here. The rear end of the bike is somewhere out here. And we're starting our descension down towards the landing. So I want to start to get those bars straight right about here. And my shoulders as well are going to square up to the landing. And I'm also going to bring my hips back, which are going to help bring the rear end of the bike around to be square again. So as we come down, squaring up the front wheel and my shoulders, accepting that landing with the arms, then everything into the bottom bracket, and we're riding into that berm. Alright, finally we're at the landing. But as we get there, we can have a little more of a view of that carve off the lip, my shoulders and hips rotating. Notice that I turn the bar, right? I'm basically throwing a whip. And then as I start to descend, my shoulders and bars square back up, so do my hips. Now notice that I'm starting to roll the bike down, so the front tire is going to impact first. Okay, my arms kind of extend there, so I can have a slight cushion of that front wheel. And then as the rear wheel sets down, because my hips have rotated around, it's going to allow that bike to kind of set down at that small angle and track forward again. If my hips were still turned, I might get what they call high-sided and thrown off the bike. But because I get my hips back around, if the bike lands slightly sideways, it's going to track back straight much easier and faster and not throw me off the bike. Going forward, as I land, notice my eyes, always important to be looking down trail, never at the front of the bike. I hadn't mentioned that yet, but it's super important. And then we roll away. Let's zip on over here to the smaller lip, and we'll have a gander at that guy as well. Nice and relaxed. Starting my body weight preload. My explosion starts, right? My shoulder is dipped. My hips are about to start to rotate. Clear that out. We go forward. I'm finishing my explosion, letting my hips come around. All right, now notice that I've squared my shoulders up to the landing as well as my hips. My arms extend, that front wheel impacts first. I kind of absorb that landing with my arms. The rear tire sets down. I'm looking straight down the trail with this weird grin on my face. And then we ride away smooth, right? And we can actually pump the bottom of this transition and get ready for that next feature. Alright guys, we're going to break down a few riders that I saw come through. Our first one, he is over at the bigger side of the hip. We see him start his carve, his explosion, but now watch as he is leaving, watch his knees starting to suck up. Okay, that's because he's absorbing the top of the lip, and watch what happens to him. See that kick? Okay, that's because he sat his butt down as he was going off the lip. Instead of really pushing his legs into the lip here, he started to absorb it instead of push into it. All right, so now let's move on to our next guy, who is also going to go off the big side. He comes off a little more on the inside to shorten it up. But he does a much better job of keeping his chest out of the way and keeping that front wheel driving in the air so he doesn't get hung up on that rear wheel. Comes around, both wheels at the same time, looking ahead. That's great. Now this last guy on the smaller side, see his chest, watch his front wheel. Notice how his front wheel is diving before he's leaving the lip. Now, he also gets bucked a little bit as he's leaving because his legs are also absorbing the lip. So a little bit of a buck there. But because he came in with speed, he was able to kind of get cleared out and still land not too bad, and right away heads up, looking pretty okay. But again, keeping that chest out of the way and not absorbing the lip, pushing into it, were the key moments for those first rider and the last one. All right, guys, I hope all that helped. All right, guys, that's gonna do it for our intro to hips. I really hope that you found this video informative. If you did, please drop a comment and remember to like, share, and subscribe. I'm here at my little workstation where the van is parked currently. We'll be heading south shortly, so if you're on the East Coast and between Killington, Vermont, and possibly Florida and would like a private lesson, hit me up. Again, we're also looking for 2 channel sponsors to really help us bridge the gap between what we need per month and what we're making per month. So if you'd be interested in that, we'd love to advertise your company or your cause. Just email us with the link below. As well, if you really like to support the channel, please become a Patreon. It doesn't cost much per month. We have all the way from 5 up to 15. And again, it really helps support me and make sure that I can put food on the table. Now, as well, in my previous videos, I have mentioned a jersey that I had signed by all my favorite riders that were available at the time. And we are gonna be raffling that off. So stay tuned. I'm just getting all the raffle stuff in place. I feel like it's gonna be the most fair to get it out so that's just not going to the person that has the most money. So stay tuned for that. Hopefully those details will be in one of the next 2 videos. But as always, guys, remember to ride hard, ride safe, be kind to each other. We are all in this together. And we'll see you in the next video. Thank you so much for all your support. It really means a lot. We met a ton of cool people here, just camped out. So if you see me in the wild, make sure to say hello. I'd love to catch a lap if we could. Take it easy, guys.